Hello guys, today we're going to study the concept of autopoiesis. Why? Because now that we have studied the theory of systems, the autopoiesis is a concept that explains living systems. What is autopoiesis? It's a term that refers to the ability of a living system, for example a cell, that can self-reproduce. So auto means self and poiesis refers to produce. So a cell can produce by itself its own molecules in order to maintain the ability of a system to live. This concept was proposed by Alberto Maturana and Francisco Varela, who were biologists from Chile. So let's see why did Alberto Maturana think on this idea of autopoiesis. So let's see a video from Alberto Maturana.
Quiero que hablemos de un concepto que surgió en Chile, que es el concepto de autopoiesis.
El concepto de autopoiesis surge en mí en el intento de contestar una pregunta que me hace un estudiante en 1960 en la Facultad de Medicina cuando yo dictaba un curso de biología. Me pregunta, doctor, usted dice que los seres vivos comenzaron hace 3.800 millones de años, que comienza hace 3.800 millones de años, de modo que usted puede decir que comenzaron entonces. Bien apurado lo digo.
¿Cómo comenzó la vida? ¿Qué comenzó ahí cuando comenzó la vida?
Exactamente. ¿Qué comenzó cuando comenzaron los seres vivos?
En la física está claro, ellos lo explican por el Big Bang.
Lo que yo quería hacer es poder decir qué comienza, no qué creo yo que comienza. Y para eso tenía que hablar de las condiciones que constituían a un ser vivo. Si las condiciones que constituyen a un ser vivo se satisfacen, entonces aparece un ser vivo. Si las condiciones que constituyen la posibilidad de un Big Bang se satisfacen, entonces aparece un Big Bang. Si las condiciones que constituyen una galaxia se dan, entonces aparece una galaxia. Bueno, aquí tenía que ver con el ser vivo. Pero para poder, eso yo tenía que saber qué es un ser vivo, para poder decir cuáles son las condiciones que se tenían que dar de modo que eso surgiese. Entonces mi pregunta era, ¿cómo sé yo que lo que estoy diciendo que constituye un ser vivo, constituye un ser vivo? ¿Cómo sé yo si lo que contesto, contesta lo que pregunto? Es una pregunta bien fundamental. Para mí eso fue una pregunta muy importante porque te cambia el modo de mirar. El preguntarte qué criterio tienes tú para aceptar la respuesta, cosa que usualmente la gente no hace, ni siquiera los científicos, muchas veces, ¿no? Porque suponen que saben cuáles son las respuestas buenas y cuáles son las
Los científicos
respuestas
son casi una casta sacerdotal, ¿no?
Claro.
Como las antiguas castas sacerdotales.
Exactamente, el club de los científicos. Pensando en eso, yo por otras circunstancias me di cuenta que lo central de los seres vivos es su autonomía. De ser sistemas tales que todo lo que pasa con ellos tiene que ver con ellos. Que lo externo no especifica lo que les pasa, sino que gatilla procesos que tienen que ver con ellos. Entonces me dediqué a pensar qué tiene que pasar en las dinámicas fisiológicas, en las dinámicas moleculares, para que surja un sistema, un ente, que tiene esas características. Y desde todo el conocimiento que yo tenía en esa época, estoy hablando de 1963, 64, empecé con la pregunta del 60 y la contesto al final del 63, me doy cuenta de que lo que pasa con los seres vivos es que todas las moléculas que los componen se producen allí. Entran moléculas y salen moléculas y forman un remolino de producciones moleculares, de modo que las moléculas que se van produciendo participan en la producción de las mismas clases de moléculas, constituyendo una unidad discreta. Y es a eso lo que he llamado autopoiesis.
¿Es una especie de autarquía biológica o no?
Es una especie... No es autarquía porque hay un flujo molecular, pero es una dinámica en la cual lo que ocurre en esa dinámica como procesos de producciones moleculares da por resultado el sistema en la cual esos procesos moleculares se producen. Entonces se produce a sí mismo. Autopoiesis, producción de sí mismo.
Now we're going to study the different characteristics of the concept autopoiesis. The first characteristic is the self-maintain or self-regulate, which refers to the ability of a living thing, which is a characteristic that only living things have, which is the ability to self-maintain in equilibrium. For example, a cell needs to live in an environment, and as we have studied before over the first term, through different processes, the cell can self-maintain in an equilibrium through processes of osmosis. For example, if the quantity of salts in the environment is too high, so the cell has the ability to self-maintain through the process of osmosis to regulate the water inside the cell and outside. Another characteristic of the autopoiesis is the autonomy of a living system. The autonomy refers to the ability of the living things to have a specialized function. For example, the stem cells are in Spanish or refers to células madre, and the stem cells are cells with the potential to develop into many different types of cells in the body. For example, the neurons have a special function in our body, and that's because of the autonomy of these cells to have a specific function to provide different abilities to the human body. The same for the muscle cells. They have a special function in the body because they are they have this ability of autonomy to accomplish a specific function in the body, and they don't depend on any other thing. So they are autonomous and they have special functions. With this characteristic of the autonomy of a living system, we can see that cells can survive because they can self-maintain in an equilibrium, but the thing is that they must be changing every single second because the processes will occur depending on what is happening in the environment. So they can self-maintain by this characteristic of the autonomy. But as the parts need to work together for the whole, so how do cells work together to help each other in the body? Well, they can self-organize. So as we studied before in the holographic principle, we studied that cells need to work together for the whole. So how do we see that in our body? Let's see a video of another biologist who can explain this with different examples.
So we showed that cells fulfill all those functions, and that meant our bodies were self-organizing cells, and not just our human cells. In any human body, estimates are we have 4 trillion human cells, but our body as a whole has about 400 trillion cells. Only 1% of them are human, and the rest are the bacteria that line your skin, all the surface that are exposed to the outside, and all the surfaces inside. So from your mouth all the way out the other end, it's all bacteria. And without those bacteria, we wouldn't survive for more than a few days after birth. The bacteria that line the creases of all your joints are stable, and they're very specific types of bacteria, and they digest the dying skin cells. And when they digest the cell membranes, they create lanolin that lubricates the joints. That's why your skin doesn't crack. And if, as a baby, you didn't have those bacteria, your skin would crack, you'd get infections, and you wouldn't live very long. Your GI tract can't form its structures without the bacteria. The genome doesn't code for the absorptive surface of the interior of the GI tract. It codes for an interaction with the bacteria lining your GI tract. And out of those two things, your absorptive surface is created. So the boy in the bubble who grows up without bacteria in the environment because their immune system can't handle it also can't digest food. If you grow a mouse in an environment like that, same thing. But then you put bacteria in their gut, and within days to weeks, they suddenly develop an absorptive surface that allows them to function. So our human bodies aren't functioning human bodies without 100 times more cells that have nothing to do with your human cells. So the body at a lower level of scale is like an ant colony made of bacteria and human cells, maybe a few other kinds of creatures, fungal spores perhaps, But mostly it's bacteria and human cells. So cells self-organize into bodies. Bodies self-organize into ant colonies if the bodies are ants. If they're humans, they organize into cities, cultures, political systems, etc. And that immediately implies then that complex systems can exist in hierarchies. So from a distance, I may see an ant colony or a flock of birds, and it will look like a solid shape, a moving shape, but it'll look like a solid thing. And if you ever see a flock of birds from a distance when you weren't necessarily expecting it, you might actually think, what's that thing in the sky? And then you realize, oh, it's birds, duh. But if you don't see what it is, you have to go more closely and observe it, and you see, oh, it's not a thing, it's a phenomenon arising from smaller things. But if you go up to that bird, or that ant, or your own body, and look at it and go, well, this level of scale, my hand looks like a thing, but in fact, it's a colony of cells self-organizing into something that looks like a thing. And when I look at it at the microscopic level, which is what I do all day long at work, is I'm looking at cells at that level. So I'm used to moving between scales like that. Then the body disappears, and it's just a flock of cells, or a colony of cells. So then I had to ask, well, are cells some fundamental unit that are in fact a thing, that can't be at a lower level of scale, that don't dissolve into a phenomenon of smaller things? Well, cells are nothing but biomolecules that self-organize in a watery solution of your body at body temperature. Where do molecules come from? Well, they're just atoms that are self-organizing. Where do atoms come from? Subatomic particles, electrons, protons, neutrons that are self-organizing. Where do they come from? Smaller subatomic particles. Where do they come from? Well, now we're getting down into the quantum realm. No one's really sure what the smallest thing is. The most popular version of that now is strings. That's what string theory is about, the smallest thing. But what physicists do have consensus about is that that smallest thing, there can't be anything smaller. You get down to a level of scale called the Planck length, which is something like 10 to the minus 37th meters, something like that. So it's very tiny. So where do they come from? Well, they just pop in and out of the vacuum. Now we think of vacuum as being something that's completely empty, but we now understand that the vacuum of outer space or inner space, whatever, isn't completely empty. It's an energy field. And that energy periodically gives rise to mass, because E equals mc squared. And when it does, most of those self-annihilate. So it's sort of like there's this foam of particles or strings or whatever coming in and out of existence. They call that the quantum foam. But sometimes they don't self-annihilate, and then they can interact with other smallest things. And they self-organize into subatomic particles, into atoms, into molecules, into people, planets, galaxies. And so that's the universe. It's just self-organizing complex systems from top to bottom.
And how does the cell can self-maintain? How does the cell can control and regulate what is happening in and out of the cell? It's because of an important structure called the cell membrane, that it's like a police, or like the police, or in other systems, the structure in charge of regulating what comes in and out. In the case of the cell, what comes into the cell and what goes out of the cell. What are the ways that needs to go out of the cell in order to keep the equilibrium in and out of the cell. So let's see what are the characteristics of the structure of the cell membrane and what are the components.
All cells are completely surrounded by a membrane that separates them from their environment, kind of like how your skin completely covers your body. This cell membrane is sometimes called the plasma membrane, and it acts as a barrier, regulating what gets in and out of the cell. Because the membrane lets some things through but not others, we say that the membrane is semi-permeable or selectively permeable. If we zoom in on the membrane, we can see that it is made of several molecular parts. Most of the membrane is made of molecules called phospholipids. Phospholipids have a head made of phosphate and two tails made of fatty acids. The heads are hydrophilic, meaning that they are attracted to water, or literally, water-loving. The tails, however, are hydrophobic, meaning that they repel water. Literally, hydrophobic means water-fearing. Because of these properties, phospholipids form two layers known as a phospholipid bilayer, with the hydrophobic tails facing each other and the hydrophilic heads facing the watery external environment and the watery cytoplasm inside of the cell. So the water lovers get to be next to water, and the water fearers can hide away from it. A perfect arrangement. The phospholipid bilayer is the main component of the membrane, and it is largely responsible for making the membrane semi-permeable. Basically, the smaller and less charged something is, the easier it is to pass through the phospholipid bilayer. Bigger, more charged things have a harder time. A second membrane component is cholesterol. Although people often think of cholesterol as a bad thing, it's actually a very important part of cell membranes, where it helps to stabilize the membrane and make it better at controlling what can pass through it. Proteins are another important part of the membrane. They do many functions, but one of the most important ones is transporting materials across the membrane, especially if they have a hard time passing through the phospholipid bilayer. A fourth membrane component is carbohydrates. These are often involved in cell identification. Blood types, for example, are the result of membrane carbohydrates attached to proteins. These help you to identify blood that belongs to you and distinguish it from foreign invaders. All of these components work together to make the plasma membrane that surrounds all cells, a critically important barrier needed for all life on Earth.
So to conclude, don't forget the three characteristics of the concept of autopoiesis, which are the ability to self-maintain or self-regulate in an equilibrium to survive in an environment. The second characteristic about the autonomy, which is the characteristic of a living system, for example, of a cell, to have a special function and to survive by itself. And the last one, which is the self-organization, which explains how do the parts work together for the whole as the holographic principle, but in this case without a consciousness. So the cells can self-organize to work together for the whole, for example, to keep us alive or to maintain the body. And don't forget that the most important structure in the cell for the autopoiesis is the cell membrane. So don't forget the components of the cell membrane and the way it regulates what comes in and goes out of the cell. So that will be all for this video. Don't forget to take notes and analyze what is around you. Goodbye.